So for the next 10 minutes, really quickly, I just want to go through the kind of the iterations again, with a little bit of focus on the last iterations. So the first iterations are just, the field test comments, right? First, we have the augmented bonding curve, field test comments. Then we have the Giveth that field test comments. Then we have the conviction voting field test comments. And all three of those will have, improved iterations of the previous ones. Even the first field test comments on the augmented bonding curve, it's very likely that we will be using someone else who, Aragon's fundraising app, and it'll be the second iteration of the fundraising app. So it's the only thing that we're really starting from scratch is conviction voting. Conviction voting, it will be the first implementation of it ever. And so we will, see major leaps and bounds for conviction voting in phase 4, in iteration 4, iteration 5, iteration 6. Everything else, though, will be starting with something that I've already started. Even in iteration 4, with the Common Stack, with the Commons Analytics dashboard. But when we get to iteration 5, the focus is on just taking what we built in the first 4 stages and continuing to improve that, while also focusing on UX and UI. And that's really stage 4, stage 5 and 6. Iteration 5 is huge on the second iteration of the analytics dashboard. And so there's a lot of stuff going on the back end of that, but also taking every single component and making it so that it fits on the phone. Because that's where, if we actually want people to use this stuff, if we actually want to strive forward and make this something that can change the world, then it's got to be on the devices that everyone has in their pocket. So that's the big focus for iteration 5. And then iteration 6 is really making it easy to deploy. So this iteration 6 is not going to be the one that works for Rivers. I keep using Rivers as an example. It's not going to be the one that works for Rivers. It's the one that we do so that the next one can work for Rivers. So this is going to be the one where we learn all the things that we need to learn so that we can keep going. Iteration 6 might be the end of our raise, but it's not the end of the Common Stack. The Common Stack is an open source framework and community that is going to continue to build economies around causes. And once we get to iteration 6, we'll have a full understanding of what it takes to build this stuff. And we will see where we go from there. I think it's a little bit ahead of the game to say, oh yeah, now we need more money right now to do anything after this. It's just too early. But by that time, if we can really build these things, then we should be able to build a system, ecosystem for ourselves. And that's where we can start continuing to push for making this so that actual rivers can have ecosystems around them. In an ideal world, though, we will be, maybe after iteration 6, if we do things right, everything falls into place. After iteration 6, we should have something that people can use to build nonprofit systems for rivers, orphans, and things. But it's hard to predict 3 years from now what's possible.
We take iteration 6 and build a common stack commons.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
Can govern itself moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, even by iteration 5, we could probably, if the tech token holders were excited about pushing the common stack forward, iteration 5 could even be the common stack one. But I doubt it. I imagine that we would do it after iteration 6.
But this is as far as we can see from the hill we're standing on. Over the course of building these 6 iterations, we'll be, going through, lots of learning curves. Once we get to this point, perhaps we'll be able to see what the next, roadmap looks like. What is component 5? What is component 6? There will probably be pivots and changes between here and there. So there isn't really much point planning this massive, multi-year project when we need to stay lean, which is why we've really broken it out into these 6 iteration strategies in the first place.
Yeah.
That's already pretty long.
Yeah.
Every iteration's goal is to support the 6th iteration and this goal that we can actually build economies around causes. So we are shooting like every step of the way. We're building towards iteration 6, and iteration 6 is of course the last one that is building towards everyone can use this. That's kind of the framework.
I just had a thought on like it's not so much naming, but it's like a way of thinking about it. Like we call number 5 is mobile first comments, but I'm just thinking like, could we try to keep that in mind as much as possible? That as of the first one, we try to think mobile first. That we try to keep things as simple as possible, so that once we optimize for mobile, that it's going to be an easy thing. Because otherwise, you cannot build mobile first if it's the 5th one, right? You see what I mean?
I would have to disagree.
Okay.
Because it's a scope issue, and like especially for the first one, man, we have so little budget, we just need to test the system, right? The underlying system is still in question until iteration 4.
I'm not saying like build mobile first immediately. I'm saying like build with mobile first in mind, in the sense that you keep your system as simple as possible, so that a translation onto mobile in iteration 5 is not going to be an issue, because that's mobile first thinking.
We will try, but I don't think it's. I think it's a huge, bigger challenge than you imagine.
What simplicity exactly are you talking about? Like we're just talking about the complex layers need to be abstracted away so we can get to a simple mobile.
I'm talking about like try to build something with keeping it in mind that you try to make it for the user as simple as possible, even if it's a huge complex system. Like don't give 75 options, because that's never going to work if you have to translate to mobile. Right. Just try to keep it simple. That was the only thing I thought.
Why do you think that building mobile would be harder? Mobile first harder?
Well, it's just we're still working on like simulating the design. So we're going to use Aragon, probably. And Aragon's fundraising app will not be optimized for mobile. Like we're going to use other people's infrastructure, and whatever it is what it is.
It's a placeholder.
I mean, it's the first step. Like for me, it's like the first iteration is like, hey, this is for desktop, and we're going to use MetaMask, and we're going to do all this, and then that will be the engine for the second iteration, where we are building a UI on top that is just for our specific UI, right? That will use the Aragon thing. People could use the Aragon UI, but why would they? Because they can use the one that's made specifically for this application, right? For the bonding curve. And for Giveth, of course, Giveth will try to be mobile first, right? But it's probably going to be a different website, and it's going to be like our focus is going to be less on UX for every component iteration, as much as it is like integration into what's already there, and then really like, does this system work, and then getting it out, pushing it out so we can get user testing. It's like, can you really focus on UX if you haven't done any real user testing? Like what buttons will go there on mobile first? What do people actually need from these systems? It's really like every iteration is beta testing, live beta testing.
But we don't need to build the technology to test the interface. We can just do a quick prototype and go into fields and do some tests and demos.
And that's actually one of the first things we'll be working on, is a proof of concept of conviction voting using CAD as a backend. So rather than doing all the solidity and all the hard work behind putting conviction voting into on chain, we're building a proof of concept with a web app front end and a CAD backend, so we can start to see how, like, what is useful user behavior, what information is useful to the user, what parameters do they really want to play with. We can start modeling this before, so there's kind of like parallel processes going on between user UX and design and building it. So.
Yeah, I guess that indeed the CAD element, etc., is going to help there as well. But I think because you mentioned Aragon, to me it's a perfect example. It was only the moment that I saw Lewis explain it in all the details, like if you go there, you have these 50 options to do this. Nobody has ever really tried this part of the system, but this is possible too. So like, imagine if you have to translate that to like making it mobile first. So like, but indeed, if we like in these first iterations, we try and like, nobody's using this, if we ask it, we're gonna cut it away, then you can get there.
Yeah, I mean the first 2 iterations won't have conviction voting. So like we'll have normal, off the shelf DAOs. It's just like the parts that we are building, of course, yeah, we'll want to do solid UX and everything, but it's gonna be a constant battle of scope. And you have the system as a whole, and we're just building this one component, right? So then how do people propose on their phones to a normal token voting DAO?
I wonder who's responsible for the design of this.
We will be working with vendors. So each vendor is designed. So for the token bonding curve, whoever we ask for a vendor, so Block Science will be doing the system design, and then the front end design will be done by the vendor that we choose.
Would it be better to have somebody managing design?
This is an option, and I think that we are likely to do that for probably not the first iteration, because we will just use, assuming that things go according to plan, we will probably just use the fundraising app. So like that's already got the system, and it'll be integrated into the DAO Aragon stuff. So for the first one, we probably won't. For the second one, that is in the budget for the bonding curve to do front end design, right? And then the second iteration, Giveth is going to do front end design for Giveth. So
I mean, not like the front end design, but the product design.
Like the UX flow.
Yeah. For example, on our hackathon in Groningen, there was like super mess with design because every team had own ideas about like how this would work. And we tried to, even through the chat, we tried to synchronize, but it felt like there was no like single person who would be saying like how we design it, like, and which features go to which design, how we manage that. So we can fail on product design if we don't have inside somebody who's gonna be structuring it.
Yeah, I think for sure by iteration 3, that will flow. I mean, for iteration 2, got to remember we're just deploying the off-the-shelf DAO with almost no UX. So the overall design, there just won't be one. We're not going to put a front end. At least the plan is not to. It's not in the budget to actually put a front end to the whatever Aragon is providing. So we'll just basically, until we get to the third one, then it's like, okay, now we have the 3 base components. We have a unified system that we're designing. Now we can have an overall designer. And then the analytics dashboard is getting integrated in and to the overall design. But until the third iteration, we're on tight budgets. So it's just hard, and we're using some difficult things. Like it's gonna be really the first 2 DAOs are gonna be just as easy to use as an Aragon DAO now. Or an Aragon DAO then, right? Whatever they have. Or maybe it'll be a DAO stack DAO, depending on who our vendors are. I mean, does that make sense, or is it?
I see what Max is saying, though, that rather than like doing UX on a component by component basis, we should be looking at it as a holistic system as well. And I think that's the plan once we start building this into a holistic system. In the beginning, it is just these like very small.
Right. I'm talking in design in a more broad sense than just like buttons and front end. It's more like who thinks like at this stage user joins, he needs to know this and this. And now this is our touch points with him. This is like what we want him to do, and so on. So these are basically the process, process design rather than just interface.
Zargham, do you have any thoughts on this? They might be muted. Z, Coach B, you guys are muted.
I was gonna say that I think it's really important for us from a messaging perspective to make decisions about who we're talking to, which is essentially what Max is saying. I mean, when we're talking about what it's like to use it, it's all about user flows. But I think maybe my biggest opinion is that at the moment, we're not really appealing to users, we're appealing to supporters and investors. So they're sort of like meta users. And so we have a different set of criteria for engaging with the people who will invest, support, deploy, create commons from people who engage with commons. And that maybe one way to proceed would be to make a very decided split between our user experience and communications exercises around our users of our infrastructure who make commons and manage commons, distinct from users of the things that those people make. And I think a lot of the times when we have confusion, it arises because we mix those two concepts. And I think we've had lots of good points about both. It might just be more about bucketing them away from each other.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we just have to accept that no matter, even if we try really hard, we're gonna have shitty UX for the first 3 comments. Right?
Yeah, and I'm actually, part of my point here though is that this is something that can be reflected in the roadmap, where we understand that the initial user is actually the person we give the crypto savvy community that we're delivering the first 3 to. That user has a different set of needs. Back to your point about familiarity with MetaMask, like it's a smaller commons in a lot of ways, but it also has specific characteristics, and we can say, what does that person need versus what does someone who's ready for the river one? And what we might actually want is a separate UX roadmap that says our target audience for commons 1, 2, and 3 has these characteristics, and therefore we're prioritizing these things. Our target audience for 4, 5, and 6 has these other characteristics. It's a broader base, it's a larger set, and that it has these additional requirements and needs and personas. And then another one after that. Maybe 3 is enough, but we could imagine this sort of, day 1 low UX, this is what we need to get the infrastructure right. Then the day 2 sort of stuff that's starting to make the next leap, but still is gonna be limited in certain ways. And then the last group. And if we imagine writing our user stories and our personas and stuff in those 3 separate phases, even though it's extra work because it's 3 docs, it essentially makes a cohesive story of how to go from where we are really to where we really want to be.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's something that we don't have any like component-based roadmaps. And I think having a UX roadmap seems like a good idea, right? Like cohesive, like strategy for once we get these things. Again, a lot of this is implementation details that got cut from our scope of like how do we get ready for the race.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But just to give Max credit, he's not wrong. We're going to get asked those questions. And what I'm suggesting is that if we do a good job factoring out the UX roadmap, the person can be pointed as appropriate. Someone who's a Moloch participant who's a potential investor is probably going to look at the short term, what are you going to deliver to me in the first 2 releases, whereas someone who's maybe a little bit more DGov oriented and has maybe a longer view with regards to sustainability might actually prefer to read about our UX plans for much further in the future. And it's just that I would expect a human to be able to understand for themselves, like which that path as a path, and that they can focus on the part of the path that resonates with them, rather than ending up with essentially loss as a result of someone saying, "Oh, this doesn't speak to me."
Yeah, I think in the end, I don't know if there's another roadmap that we need. There probably is. But we need an individual roadmap for UX, augmented bonding curve, Giveth, conviction voting, analytics dashboard, and CAD. That is like so that someone can go and see how does CAD advance.
Yeah, but the UX one is the most salient in the race. Because for all that those other ones are going to continue to get fleshed out over time, they are as you say, implementation details, and the narrative does explain their purpose, whereas the UX one is visceral. So people need to see the UX roadmap actually long before they would need to see the details of the other quote unquote component roadmaps.
Okay. Cool. Well, is there any questions on mobile first or ready to deploy iterations? We're kind of just blazing through them because we have a lot of other stuff to cover. But okay, so augmented bonding curve. This is the actual starting point of the system. Hopefully Jordy will roll in pretty soon, but I had a feeling he might be late.
Did you want to, I was just thinking that since you put CAD on the board, I think we do need to maybe, if you want to save the bonding curve for when Jordy gets here.
I want to
not
save
really.
CAD for when Jordy gets here.
Well, yeah, I wasn't even going to dive into it. I just pulled up on the screen here how CAD is kind of like a layer below our other components. So like all of the robust design of the bonding curve, of conviction voting, of analytics and so on is all based on kind of the foundational layer of token engineering tools and processes that goes into CAD. So CAD is an important component of the common stack, but it's not a component in the same way that these are, the module templates that will be in the common stack library. CAD kind of provides this foundational layer that each of these are built, simulated, modeled, tested rigorously so that they can be used knowing that these components work on their own and they're interoperable to build whatever commons initiative on top of that component layer that users are looking to build.
Maybe it's an easy thing to just say, like, we have our 4 puzzle pieces to build our whole commons when you talk about it. Otherwise,
Right.
people will look at this and they will be like, yeah, but I still look at that and LCC this.
Right, so that's, I was trying to differentiate that in this diagram here, and that'll be in the system OpenJS when we'll add in some context around that.
Cool. So augmented bonding curve.
So Jeff,
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So I would say just letting Jeff present potentially against Abby's article, and then letting me do Q&A, because I admittedly have a tendency to want to go. I mean, I've been doing a lot of work on these and I can describe a lot of the math, but I don't think the answers that you guys want are proofs. And so I'm going to defer to Jeff to describe it, and then I will answer questions based on that knowledge.
Yeah. Do you want to dive into it? I can too.
For the bonding curve.
Yeah. Is that okay with you, Jeff?
Yeah. Do you want me to pull up the...
I would present against Abby's article. We also have Python notebooks and markdowns, but I think Abby's article is relatively well tuned to mostly visuals and concepts, as opposed to the code and math documents are a little heavier on stuff people aren't going to want to look at.
Yeah, and maybe I can just start it off with the high level part of this, which is that there's 2 phases of the bonding curve. It's the hatch and the open. And it gets very confusing for everyone that there's 2 different phases. It's very common that it's like, okay, what's happening in this and what's happening in that? In the hatch phase, you have people who are allowed to buy in. It's permissioned. Only a select few people that are on the whitelist, which will probably end up being a token itself, will be allowed to participate in the hatch. The hatch funds the funding pool and the collateral pool. Right? So the theta goes into the funding pool, 1 minus theta goes into the collateral. So when people are buying tokens, they have a price of P0. This is not on the bonding curve.
Have you used other terms? Collateral pool? Funding pool?
Reserve pool. Collateral pool, I think, is a little bit better, but we'll see. So P0, the initial price, is not how much money goes into the collateral pool. right? It's how much money goes into the collateral pool and the funding pool. So if someone pays 10 cents per token, then and theta equals, let's say, 0.3, that means 30% will go to the funding pool. If they raise 1 million, 700K will go to the collateral, and 300 will go to the funding pool. Okay. So this is not on the bonding curve. Then we go to the open phase. Open phase is open. Ta-da! Yay! Permissionless. When people send money to the bonding curve in the open phase, it all goes into the collateral pool. The initial price is P1, and this is on the bonding curve. And for the first 2 iterations, it's 30 cents.
But in the hatch, you say nothing is on the bonding curve.
Nothing is on the. There is no bonding curve.
It's not started in the hatch phase.
No, no.
It's hatching.
It's hatching. It's like you know. I don't want to get into it. I was going to make an analogy to abortion. I'm not going to do it. I just can't help myself. Okay, so we're in the hash phase. There is no bonding curve. The bonding curve is initialized by the hash phase. In fact, the actual shape of the curve is determined by how much money is raised. So there is no bonding curve. And then the bonding curve is set at this interface, right? And that's when, okay, now we have a bonding curve. And everybody's tokens here are locked. There's a vesting period, right? Here, there is not. Here, all the tokens are free, always. There's never a locking period, at least in our current design. And I assume it's going to stay.
Unlocked instead of free.
Sure, unlocked. Good point. They're not free.
They're
Yeah,
unrestricted.
definitely
I
not.
would even call them unrestricted, because technically people own those tokens and they were non-transferable anyway. So what you're actually doing is restricting them from the burn mechanism.
Yeah.
So they're not even actually locked. They're just they have a restriction preventing them from being used in the burn until they have vested.
So we'll have to figure out locked or unlocked as verbiage.
Yeah. One thing I'd like to point out about this whole concept of hatch versus live, and I'm hoping this will help for narrative purposes. Essentially, the bonding curve is like an energy conservation equation. So what happens when you hatch the bonding curve or you hatch the commons is you determine the system's initial energy state, and the bonding curve preserves it. So the thing we call the invariant is essentially the system's energy balance. And the way that the bonding curve hatch to live really works is that when it's launched, that energy balance is determined, the invariant is set. And then forever, any burning or minting actions are precisely the actions that preserve that invariant or preserve that energy conservation equation. And this is the reason that we have strong results in a sort of token engineering sense, because when we decide what this energy balance equation is, we're defining what Jeff calls the token physics. And as a result, we get strong arguments about certain properties of the circular economy coming from the fact that the blockchain enforces this physical law. Now, most of our real physics engineering work is built on natural laws. So F equals ma, K equals IR, etc. What we're saying in this bonding curve design is that as the creator of the bonding curve, we decide what that V equals IR equation is. In our case, it's going to probably be, this equation with S to the fourth over R. And the curvature of that energy function is the power. And that curvature defines a notion of diminishing returns, which in turn defines some other properties. We don't have to go into it, but we use computational experiments to explore the financial implications of different energy laws. And then we choose our energy law, and that's a conserved fact. But the hatch is something that says, what is the actual initial energy level? So it has to be thought of as a separate process. because obviously the energy isn't conserved during the part of the process that determines how much energy there is.
Yeah, so just to repeat that, it's basically we are setting some parameters, right? But not all of them before the hatch. We're setting the initial price and the price after the hatch. But what we're not setting is the amount of money that's being raised. And so once we have, this, we'll set theta. We'll set a few other parameters to initialize the curve. But the hatch actually sets a very important parameter, which we call D0. This is the initial donation, right? This is how much money did people actually send to this commons. Once we have that parameter, we determine the token physics, is what we say, right? We determine all the equations that we live under this curve. And the most important equation is this invariant equation that he says. We will set this number, which is kappa, beforehand. It'll be set along the sides of theta. But what isn't set is this random number. This random number is basically derived from a combination of all the variables, especially and D0 being the last missing piece. And then once we have this number, that is like gravity, right? That is
the speed of light.
Yeah.
Like it's a constant in the system, and that brings the stability to the system because the speed of light is a constant everywhere in the universe, and therefore all of these more complex mathematics can depend on this like constant. That is our speed of light in this system.
And the simplest way to explain it is that it's the token supply over the collateral in the pool. There is a constant ratio between the token supply to some power divided by the collateral in the pool, and it'll always equal this constant.
And to be, this is actually kind of important. A lot of people tend to draw a curve that has supply on the x-axis and price on the y-axis, and that curve will actually be the derivative of the equation that you have there, and it often looks like, and people complain about Ponzi schemes because they see this bending upwards, and so you can draw an upward bending curve there. But what's important is that we're going to draw another curve which actually is got reserve on the x-axis. So we're going to have two different plots, and both of these are in our demos and stuff, so they can be pulled up. But there's something very important about changing the x-axis here when you think about it. So that's the one with reserve. This is a diminishing returns curve. It's a concave function. What this means is that the reserve variable, that represents an independent variable in the sense that we can assume that the reserve is always sort of worth the same. It's an XDAI or a fiat equivalent or a whatever. But the difference between having supply on the x-axis and reserve is whether the value of the thing is truly independent. Supply's value is not independent. It's dependent. And as a result, you get weird, incorrect assumptions if you put it on an x-axis and just think of, try to reason. And I know this is sort of, maybe it's people don't care that much, but it's important to understand that this is sort of a figment of your expression of the same math. It's all the same math. The curves are all internally consistent. But when you don't put a truly independent variable on the x-axis, the human interpretation is often slanted or skewed or misunderstood. And so we really want to push people to think about this in terms of the reserve on the x-axis, and then you can plot both price and supply on the y-axis, where price and supply are related by a derivative, and that this conceptually gives you a sense of how the system will actually behave as a engineered, like a space with restrictions. And we want people to understand that the reason that the bonding curve work is because this diminishing returns provides a sort of back pressure against bloat. So it basically says, if I want to, pump this, I'm going to get diminishing returns on my pump. And because of that, I shouldn't push it unless I really believe it's going to go up and stay up, because I have again, this energy conservation equation enforcing diminishing returns, meaning that if I'm wrong, I will essentially lose money because I have exposed myself to the effect of my change. And in physics, we can think about this like, if I want to push a boulder up a hill, I can't teleport it up to the hill. I have to expend the energy to get the boulder up the hill. So if the boulder then just rolls back down the hill, I wasted my energy. And so this is the kind of conservation laws that are embedded in the mathematical approach. We get people to not move the system unless they believe it should move and stay moved, because they incur the energy cost of making the change that they made. And this is a property that's different in blockchain-enabled liquidity pools from traditional sort of buy-side, sell-side markets, where you're actually just taking a price rather than realizing a price.
I have a question.
Yep.
I feel like this is really important to understand, and I'm just not quite there. Like, can we just say really simply, like, the essential difference between measuring with supply crossing reserve?
And that second graph's not right, so it might be confusing. So the supply reserve still doesn't bend up. Both of those bend down.
Okay, my bad.
The ones that bend up have supply on the x-axis. The ones that bend down have reserve on the x-axis.
So the biggest problem here is that
price.
yeah, is that culturally in the initial like explanation of bonding curves, everyone's been plotting price versus supply.
Wait, price versus supply or price versus reserve?
Culturally, since the initial like creation of bonding curves and explanation of bonding curves, people have been plotting price versus supply. However, that is in our system, that is not an accurate portrayal of what's actually happening. So,
and it's also not specific to our system, because to be clear, we actually have a three-dimensional space. Price, supply, and reserve are all well defined. It's just that when you project it onto a two-dimensional axis, you're making a choice about a perspective. And what's happening is that the perspective is influencing people's interpretation in a direction that's not aligned with reality. So
Okay. So
we're trying to figure out how communication-wise to help solve this, what I'll call this sort of naive critique that these things are Ponzi, come from the intuition that arises from putting supply, which is a dependent variable, on the independent axis.
to keep it simple, we just don't plot price versus supply. Okay, like that's the final, like that's it. We plot price versus reserve, and we speak about it in those terms.
And Griff, if you
And
say,
supply versus reserve.
well, you say reserve,
But we won't even plot that. No one cares about this.
No.
Really, only people care about the price.
And to be honest, this is like the token engineering. All this is too complex for our normal explanation. This isn't how we're going to talk about these things. How we're going to talk about it is like what's on the screen here. This is like the deep dive into the math and
but
the
it's
specifics.
Well, I think it's something that people very commonly would
The squares off. So
concept of, especially if they're having this misconception.
see, this is
I mean, yes, on a token engineering level, yes. We're going to
Which is
explain
our-
this to
It's
Very
square.
next,
So it never actually, you
No.
can still get to those things.
right?
uh,
You can move flat.
this, yes,
Those are the best.
a little bit.
The invariant probably not.
Really, what we're going to explain is what's on the screen now. A community takes the common stack components and hatches a curve.
Feelings, and then we
Is basically a crowdfunding process where you initialize the collateral pool and the funding pool, and then we go into the open phase where the public can buy and sell. It goes up and down this price curve, and that generates funds for the funding pool. That is like the simple, let's get everyone on board with how the hatch phase and the bonding curve works. If they say, okay, let me know exactly how that works, what's the math behind it? Okay, we've got invariance, we've got this is our price reserve curve, this is the theta, this is the deep dive into how it works. But on a higher level, this is
sent you an image from this sort of with burned here. He wanted it's related to your drawing with the flat line, but a Python example of a plot in the common stack org for you to like plop open quickly, hopefully to help. It's similar to your diagram, but I want to like match your doodles with the data. I just sent you.
I just wanted to say, I think it would be good to add to the list that at one point we actually need write an article to answer that one question, like, why is this not a Ponzi scheme? What is the difference between an augmented bonding curve and a Ponzi scheme? Because that's a question that's going to come back often. And then you can like link to even deeper mathematics, but like explain very as simple as possible, this is the difference. I think that could help. The second little thing I wanted to say
Or
is,
can you hold
yeah.
hold that thought? Hold that thought, because how can I hold the next thought? Like,
okay,
hold that thought.
Like,
Hold it.
a lot.
Hold it
Okay.
hard. Okay, this is not a Ponzi scheme for two main reasons.
Yes.
A company issuing a share in their company for themselves and their employees is not a Ponzi scheme, and this is effectively the exact same thing. It is a representation of the future value of this community, just like if someone starts a business and they have shares in that business that they sell to their friends or to their employees, right? In a closed system. I'm not talking about going public on stock, but just someone who creates shares in a company. It's the exact same thing, and we're following the exact same model. So that's the best analogy, I think. The other piece is that Ponzi schemes don't have underlying production. This has underlying production. There is this bonding curve piece, if not augmented, would be a Ponzi scheme. And proof of weak hands doesn't have the funding pool, which actually is producing value. And that's the piece that allows this to be a economy and not a Ponzi.
And the third element is probably the mathematics. Actually.
But to retroact the negative aspects that still come along with these Ponzi, these curves, is we do the design. Yeah, I think that is definitely the third part that's worth mentioning is that, hey, we're pushing back so that as it gets larger, it actually, there's effort to make it smaller.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Yeah, so traditional token bonding curves that just have the collateral pool, you put your DAI or Ether into a smart contract and you get back your token. The only thing giving that traditional bonding curve value is the collateral. So yes, that is a direct Ponzi. If you put more in, then the next person who puts more in, you take it out. But when we split up the collateral pool into the funding pool and the collateral pool, and we're saying that your tokens have governance over this funding pool, we are imbuing these tokens with other forms of value. So now it's not just a claim on the collateral pool, it is also governance over the funding pool, which has a value all on its own. So if everyone says, oh, let's sell, the last person here, Chris, who has the only 10 community tokens, governs that whole funding pool. And all those whales just sold, leaving all their money in the funding pool because of the exit tribute. As they sold all their money, more exit tribute goes into the funding pool. And Chris, the last person who has community tokens, gets to govern that whole funding pool. And all these whales are going to go, oh shit, Chris is the only one who has governance on that. This has its own value. So we're going to buy back in because we want to determine where these funds go as well. So you're imbuing the token with multiple forms of value by splitting up into a reserve pool and a collateral pool. And there is an article in the roadmap coming on the augmented bonding curve, not a deep dive with the explainer. We'll talk about
So that's almost even like fourth argument. It's like it's that governance, actually, right?
Curation value. For sure.
Curation value.
Yeah.
Okay.
So if you guys would hazard me babbling a bit more too, what's important about bonding curves as invariants and bonding curves like what we're talking about is that they're not actually anything other than interfaces. If you remember from the session early, Jeff described it as the boundary system, because what bonding curves do is they interconnect two forms of value. So you get a Ponzi scheme if one of those forms of value is not real. So if you connect dollars to imaginary bullshit, you get a Ponzi scheme. If you connect dollars to the decision-making process of allocating funds, or In the Fairmont continuous orgs, it's the equity that rights in the startup. In any system that has a bonding curve, I've been talking to some folks at Siemens about energy markets. Like anytime the two assets that are bound by the bonding curve are both real, then what you're talking about is the bonding curve as an interface or as a connector. And so you engineer the connector to have certain properties. And in fact, they work a bit like capacitors, again, because we're creating a system model where we have an energy conservation law that governs what it means to charge it up. And I'm going to stop, but the one thing, Jeff, your curve, if you put reserve, that bends the other way. It bends down, not up. That curve, yeah. So this is the important part of the concept of diminishing returns. This is a non-decreasing function with a negative second derivative. So it's concave. That means that you always get more for more, but the amount more you get is less. And this is a very critical mathematical property in estimation, optimization, automation. Convexity and concavity are actually foundational mathematical principles for system design. And so the difference between having a concave and a convex function here massively impacts the nature of the economy. And so when these things get muddled, it means that there's a lot of breakdown, not just in the intuition, but also the sort of reality of what someone will experience. So we do need to be careful about how we think about it. I will also note that if the power is 2, that line is actually, the invariant power is 2, then that line's actually straight. So that downward curvature is, and again, you can look at the math in the documents if you want, is not the same for the relationship between reserve and supply and reserve and price differ by one derivative. So if it's a squared relation in supply to reserve, then it's a square root curve on this axis, and its derivative ends up giving you something that you actually end up getting. Anyway, I'm done. You can look at the articles if you want. The point is we've actually worked through it.
Cool. That's good. That's good for me to understand. I don't know if we need to get into that level of detail for the.
Yeah, you have the math books too, and I'm allowed to some extent. I can talk about some of the other projects that we've used the similar design principles for, so that there's some, for learning purposes for your writing, Jeff. I suspect that some like review of others will help you synthesize the parts that are, functional, always there, no matter who makes whatever commons, versus the things that are specific to one common.
Yeah.
This visual should go in your funding.
It already is.
Oh, good.
These are the ones I've been working on over the past few days. So this is in a nutshell the bonding curve. This is the hatch here. This is the open here. So the hatch, just to explain, everyone gets in kind of at this constant rate, P0. Now this is where the magic happens, because a bunch of people put in money at P0 and suddenly the curve launches at P1. Now, how that happens? Math. Okay, we don't need to worry too much about it. What people will be worried about is, well, if we all put in money at P0 and it comes out at P1, well, what if everyone just sells right away because they just made a 3x return from 10 cents to 30 cents? Well, they can't do that because there's a vesting period. So you cannot sell your tokens right away. These tokens that were created in the hatch are protected by these vesting curves. And also they're protected by the exit tribute. So in other words, what we just talked about is that run on the bank where everybody says all of a sudden, I want to sell. Okay, you can sell, but you're going to pay a portion of your profits into the funding pool. And all of a sudden, Chris is going to be the last person with governance tokens over the whole funding pool. Well, then people will want to get back in. So there'll be a certain point, when people are selling, that it's more valuable to hold the token for governance over the funding pool than it is to get money out for your profits.
I just, to something you just said, a question. So is it possible that some of the tokens received during the hatch wouldn't start vesting until like midway into the open period, or is it
They start vesting here.
Right. Okay.
So this is a vesting curve. So you'll get like a little bit of tokens.
So it starts
Right.
out for 2 months, nothing.
Right, sorry. So for
But
2 months,
regardless
you have
of-
no vesting.
Regardless of whether I give it at the beginning of the 2 months or midway through or whatever, they all start, like the vesting period is the same for everyone who participated in the hatch.
Yes.
Okay.
On proportionally. So if I put in $1 million and you put in 10.
Of course, yeah. Okay, and then first, the first thing I wanted to say, it's not really, it's just a little remark more than a question. Like, because you say in the beginning, you say, I'm inclined towards using the word collateral pool in the beginning. Could we also use collateral on our graph? Because to me, collateral is it makes more sense as a word as well than
Yeah,
reserve.
instead of reserve right here.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
In all the math,
I would.
but
Audible.
But
So
collateral,
I would suggest that we distinguish the terms in the following way. We can call this the collateral pool, but we should refer to the units of the collateral pool as being in the reserve currency. So this whole notion of an independent variable ties back to the idea that the form of value in the collateral pool needs to be a sort of independently valuable thing. So it's a fiat equivalent, it's a DAI, it's something like that. And what we don't have to pre-specify what it is. It just has to be a reserve currency, not a. I mean, again, we could define the reserve currency to be Ethereum if someone wanted to, but again, we would be injecting noise into the system because it has a variable value in the real world. So we want to highlight the fact that the unit should be something of perceived constant value, and so that's the reason I've been using the term reserve. But I think that you're right, Chris, that we should probably think of the collateral pool as being denominated in or containing reserve currency.
yeah, because then people make the link easier between the two concepts, and otherwise it's easier to understand it.
So this would still be reserved then in
No.
that case.
I think it should be collateral too.
Yeah, and I just want to
It's-
follow up to say it's sort of incumbent on the communications team to help connect those dots for other people. So which can be easily done with a sentence like our collateral pool, which holds the reserve currency of DAI or Ether or whatever. I mean,
But if it's on the graph as collateral, it's gonna, even if we talk about reserve currency, if it's on the graph as collateral, people are gonna understand it better, why this
right
is so
for
different.
sure. Yeah. We should
From a data visualization perspective, simply make the habit of listing the name of the axis is collateral and the units of the axis is reserve currency. It's very common to have both concepts on the same graph, and as long as we follow best practices for drawings, I think name units, and it shouldn't be confusing.
Yeah, okay, in that sense, it makes sense. Okay, cool, thanks. And then I had a question, it's a follow-up on the thing that Jeff said. So it's probably a stupid one, but I really want to grasp this, I guess it's the moment. Like, if I'm the only one who's in at the end, Chris is the only one who has now governance power, and Jeff said then other investors are going to want to buy back in. Why? Can I just like take the funds and do whatever I want with it if I
Yeah.
don't?
Totally.
But
If
I mean, technically up to the restrictions of the decision-making process. So consider the following, that you might have, say you have $10,000 left and you have all the governance tokens. Technically, that means that your ability to make a decision is complete, but the system still limits the rate at which you can actually issue funds. So you can't just dump it because you will have to respect the commons rate limiters. So when you make it, you have to make a proposal, then the proposal has to charge up, then it needs to pass according to the trigger function, then those funds get issued into a milestone. And like what we're suggesting here then is that even if you're the last remaining person, you don't just get to push a button and take all the money out. You still have to use the disbursement processes, and they have time lags in them, which means that if other people see that the system is in that state, they have the total opportunity to look at what proposals you made and say, hey, no, I'd rather use that money for some other thing. Then they buy in on the bonding curve, and then they vote for something else.
okay,
So as you move down the curve, as people start burning their tokens, collateral is constantly being pulled out, but also funding through the exit tribute is growing. So as you move down the curve, the funding pool gets larger, and eventually you'll get to this point, assuming that enough tokens are vested, that holding one token, $1 worth of token, can spend $1 worth of funds here. And of course, there's the time lag, right? So it might be like one token will, after 30 days, be able to spend $1 worth of funds, but there's still, that's pretty crazy, you know? So why wouldn't you?
Also, just to be very clear, there's not going to be it's not a perfectly linear relationship because it depends on the actual amount of conviction that a proposal needs to pass. Also has a diminishing returns effect where if you're trying to pass a proposal that's asking for 10% of the total funding pool.
Yeah, I don't want to get over the weeds of conviction voting. I don't want to.
Okay, sorry. No, but I want to make sure that we don't make a mistake. It implies linearity where it isn't there.
Yeah,
so
it's definitely a higher overview, but we'll dive into the weeds of conviction voting much later.
Okay, cool. Just making sure that we don't make a misconception though. It's not one-to-one.
And we'll fix. Yeah, it's never one-to-one. There's lots of variables. Conviction voting.
I always add after every sense. It's more complicated than this.
Yeah,
there is.
We can always compute what that relationship is, so we can tell them the number, but the number isn't always the same.
The main idea is that the funding pool growing kind of pushes people up the curve when you're going down, and the curve bending this way pushes people down the curve when you're going up. So you have this force acting against the race to exit, and you have this force acting against the Ponzi dynamic, right?
And that volatility. So we don't expect people to just like the price to get here and then it stays. Some people are going to say, I want to take profits, okay? And then people are going to say, oh wow, it's a good time to get in so I can affect funding governance, okay? And this volatility moving up and down the curve feeds the funding pool. So as people buy and sell and buy and sell and buy and sell, the funding pool is filled with money and the commons can do work. So this is kind of the engine. We want this volatility, some range of volatility, but people are going to, exactly.
Yeah. And to go back to the like company shares idea, right? This is especially relevant for continuous organizations and not so much us, but that's really their main value proposition, is that they can determine a market price for a small market cap stock that isn't even like an openly traded stock. It's just being issued by the issuer, but they can actually create a market value for that makes sense based off of math, right? Whereas if I start a small company and I issue shares to my coworkers, what is the value of those shares? No one really knows. Here we can actually determine, with this bonding curve, we can actually determine the price and allow people.
In that sense, it's a little different because it's not a free floating value.
I mean, it is a free floating value, but it's based off of supply and demand.
Right.
It's not a. It's
Rather than based
a
on
regulated
perception.
It's effectively internally regulated. It's internally regulated. It's just like
Right.
It's not it is a free market externally, but there's internal like regulatory action.
There's another buffer between like people's perception and its effect on the price.
Yeah, and which is really amazing because now we can actually like mathematically scale, real world economies. This is like really fucking wild, like with crypto and all this stuff, they were able to build economies around causes, but very deterministic, very like controlled by the free market dynamic. Now we can actually say, okay, let's design how the supply and demand interact with this economy. And we can actually build economies around causes and simulate those economies, test them. I mean, this is fucking wild. It's not something that was before possible without CAD and token bonding curves.
And that's the thing that to understand this, so I kind of get it, but like the thing that you say, you're pushed up and down the curve and like the funding pool, like having that at some point, imagine that we get all our funding. I hope that when we get to like the 6th iteration, and that at some point we can open it to like larger audience, that communication wise we can invest in like making animations to really visualize this so that people can grasp it who are not developers and engineers.
I
You
hope
know?
we can do that before the 6th iteration.
Yeah, well, during that, like, yeah, that we can start working on that as soon as we have funding to do
No,
it.
exactly. If we raise all the funding for the 6th iteration in that month period, then we can start that right away.
That would be great.
Please.
Because it's fucking fun.
Let's see, what time is it? Do you guys have? We have 6 minutes. Do you guys have more questions on token bonding groups? No.
I'm not gonna pretend that I completely get it. I get it while you explain it, and a second later, I would not be able to repeat it, and I think that's okay. But like at some point, I hope it will be, yeah, that we have visualizations that people will be able to grasp without being mathematicians.
After our first, the roadmap that we laid out for comms yesterday, this is the augmented bonding curve explainer article.
Yeah.
That's what we just did, and we need to simplify that and put it out on Medium.
And for the group of you guys, I mean, well, obviously we're iterating on comms a lot as a team, but I think it's going to continue to be the case that GIFs, visuals, and clickable prototypes for the maths are going to go a really long way for this stuff, because people aren't going to grasp it intellectually, they're going to grasp it experientially.
Yeah,
And we know that that's how we're going to have to teach it, but internally we kind of got to continue to work through the whys and the hows so that we correctly represent it when we map it into basically toys and visuals and videos.
Yes.
And our main investors are more on the spectrum of Zargum than on the spectrum of normal people. So, it's okay. Like, our contributors will be willing to dive into some of this stuff. So, it's not the end of the world, but it's coming.
But that also means that we have to be prepared to answer their questions, because I will note that a lot of people are aware, but not necessarily going to be able to do the math themselves. And so what we're going to get are people who read the math and think about whether it makes sense to them, but they aren't necessarily going to be able to reproduce the proofs, which is what you would normally do if you were like an academic reviewer. And I've been working with academics and control theorists and economists to make sure that I've been getting peer review, at least privately, on a lot of this work from multiple universities, Penn, Vienna, etc. And it's important for us to understand that at first principles, we can say, here, let's explain it to you. But if there's a contention at the level of, if people can't validate it for themselves, we have to basically appeal to authority. And to the extent that I can manage it, I'm trying to get more of this work into publications with those collaborators in order to serve as foundations that are citable. ZX's thesis, for example, which we shared, master's thesis out of Penn, has some token engineering concept in it, not specifically the bonding curve stuff. But broadly speaking, I think it's very important for us to build on the fact that we aren't just making all this stuff up. We're actually getting our peer review from actual mathematical and economics experts, so that it's not just a question of like, hey, do I believe you? But actually someone serving as a validator in the mathematics sense is actually qualified to be that validator.
Yeah. So I just we went over this yesterday in the comms session, but just to make everybody clear, we've identified 3 layers of audience that we are communicating these concepts to. Our general audience are people who will be using these things. They don't need to know most of this detail. They just need to know how it's useful to them. This is a continuous fundraising mechanism. It works like this and this. Cool.
And they're also not who we're going to be talking to.
Not for a while. The crypto audience, they know what token bonding curves are. They know what augmented bonding curves. Once we explain this, we can get into some of this detail with them. The academics in like the Zargum level, this is the people who would be reading the augmented bonding curve deep dive article. That goes into the math. It goes into the derivation of the invariant. It talks about the invariant. It's a little bit blurry what concepts need to be at which level of audience at this point, but we definitely have 3 different explanations going deeper and deeper into the mathematics underpinning this. Up until now, we've been very much talking about all of these concepts all the time, so it's confusing sometimes to someone why there's an invariant when we're trying to, or what, S to the 4 over R is. That is kind of like at a deeper level of understanding. So just so we know, there are multiple audiences for multiple explanations of this complex.
And this is crypto audience is probably like general crypto audience who has vaguely heard about token moniker, and then you have like token engineers who are like already really looking into everything that's tokens, right? Hey, party.
Cool. Well, I think we can end the token bonding curve discussion and go for lunch.
And Jordy missed it.
That's okay. Jordy will get it during 2 hours of lunch. So, yeah.
So we'll catch you guys in 2 hours.
Yeah, 2 o'clock. 2 o'clock sharp.
What? Oh, that's nice. I just made you guys a lunch.
See, Coach B, Z, you guys are muted. Kai, everyone's muted.
See ya.
2 o'clock.
Cool.
We have to, my call's at 1.
Oh,